In this video, I'll discuss scoring, steaming, how to get your dough into the oven, and how to tell when it is done baking. In the last video, I discussed oven spring and how to maximize that when you put your dough in the oven. And steaming and scoring both also play a role in that. Scoring refers to cutting the top of your dough before it goes into the oven. And you want to do this right before it goes in the oven. So you do not want to shape your dough and cut it and then let it rise for an hour. It happens at the oven when you're about to put it in. So there are many different reasons that we score the dough. Perhaps the most obvious is to create patterns on the surface of the dough just to make it look nice. Scoring also creates a weak spot on the dough so that as it expands, the gas will move toward the places where you cut. And this helps you avoid those blowouts on the side or bottom of your loaf if the gas doesn't have anywhere to go, and it heads for another weak spot. Scoring can help your dough expand, and this depends on how proofed it is. So if your dough is fully proofed, that's great. But if it's underproofed, so say the company is coming for dinner and you have to put it in the oven and it's not ready yet, scoring can help it expand, and you can use deeper cuts to compensate for it being underproofed. On the other hand, if your dough ends up overproofed, you would want to use more shallow cuts or maybe not cut it at all. And one final thing is that by cutting your dough evenly over the whole surface, that helps it expand evenly. And a demonstration you can do to see this is make just a tiny little X right in the center of your loaf, and it will rise into what I call the volcano loaf, because the gas inside kind of rushes toward the center, and instead of being a nice round ball, your bread will come out kind of pointy toward where you cut it. Bakers use a razor blade to cut the dough, and the French word is spelled L-A-M-E. I believe the correct pronunciation is lame. So there are disposable ones like this or this, but the blades do wear out surprisingly quickly, considering you're only cutting dough with them. So if you're gonna use it a lot, I would recommend investing in one like this, where you can take the blade on and off, and so you can buy replacement blades. You can also use all four tips. So you use one and then you flip it around and use another one. When you use this, you cut with one tip of the dough. So you're not cutting with the whole flat side like this, but you angle it and just cut with one tip. If you don't have a razor blade, I would use a serrated knife. With the knife, you would cut with sort of a center section, not the tip. So the main point here, other than being careful, is to move quickly to avoid that dragging force. So the quick motion looks something like this. See, just nice and fast. On the other hand, the slow or sort of dragging motion is more like this. See, I'm trying to go carefully, but the whole loaf is pulling in that direction. And then, when I see the knife, again, I'm going to use the middle of the knife, and it's fast. And the knife does drag a little bit more than the razor blade does. You want to just do the motion and don't worry too much about having the perfect placement or getting the perfect length. Just, be careful, but move quickly. What I would recommend is sacrifice a loaf and just practice cutting on it. So just keep making cuts, and doesn't matter what it looks like, just to get a lot of practice. Your loaf will come out, funny looking. It won't look like what everybody else has on Instagram, but we'll have a better story because it will be the loaf that you learn to score on. So baguettes are often scored in a pattern that looks a little bit like lemons. I will show a picture to show you what I'm talking about if you're not familiar with it. And the way you get that pattern is not obvious. So it's not cuts that go across the loaf, but rather lines that go right down the center, slightly overlapping, and sort of the classic style is to hold the blade at an angle which creates a slight lip on each cut. And again, you have to move quickly, and so you're trying to do a lot all at once. I know it's kind of hard to see at the angle that my camera's at, but I'll just do this one to give you a general idea. So this would be the blade upright. I'm going to tilt it so that it's at an angle and just do 4 or 5 cuts right down the center. So next I'll talk about steam. In a commercial bakery, after they put the dough in, they just push a button on the oven and it shoots water, steam into the oven, and that sticks onto the surface of the dough and does a few things. So what this does is, for one thing, it slows down the crust drying out, and this allows the dough to expand for longer before the crust forms and it has to stop expanding. It also slows down the crust browning, and this enables the dough to bake on the inside before it gets too dark on the outside. And finally, steam gives your loaf a nice brown crust and a crust that's shiny and crispy. So a question I get often is, well, I don't want a crispy crust. I want soft dinner rolls. Do I just not steam it? Because of the steam helping your dough expand, you would still want to steam it. And the way to accomplish getting a soft, squishy roll is by using a recipe for such a roll. So these recipes would usually have some kind of fat, like a butter or an oil in it. So you wouldn't want to just take a hearth bread like a French or a sourdough and not steam it to try to get your dinner rolls to be soft. So over the years, I have encountered many methods people have come up with to steam their dough when it goes in the oven. I just want to go over a few safety concerns. If you're spritzing water into your oven and you hit the light in there, you can crack the light. I've done that. If you are using a method with water going into your oven and you drip onto the glass of the door, you can crack that also. Done that. I have been told that steam in the oven can put cracks in the enamel of the walls. I'm not really sure about that one. I've not witnessed that. I've just been told that. And then finally, of course, steam can burn you. So if you are doing something that creates a big burst of steam, just make sure that you have a plan to not be anywhere near it. So a simple method would be to have a spray bottle like this, and before your dough goes in, just spritz it a few times. Remember, you always want to label your bottles so that you don't get it mixed up with the cleaner. Sometimes, even if you do this, that's not enough. So I know some people will spritz their dough and then they put it in the oven and they spray in the oven before they shut the door. If you don't have a spray bottle, you can just wet your hands and pat them on your dough before it goes in. I've seen some people who pre-steam the oven by having like a cake pan with some water in it, and they have that in there about 30 minutes before their dough goes in, and some of it evaporates so that the oven is a more steamy environment and the walls won't be quite as dry. If you do that, just remember that that water is absorbing heat. So when your dough goes in, you would want to take that water out so that it's not competing with your dough for the heat of the oven. And then I've also heard of some more elaborate methods, like someone had a cast iron pan on the floor of the oven and they would preheat that with the oven, and then when they put the dough in, they would chuck some ice cubes into it and shut the door really fast, and of course the ice cubes hit the pan and melt and burst into steam. Or even the same thing but with a cup of water pouring onto the hot pan. I even met someone who had rigged up a tube into his oven so he could shut the door and then pour water into the tube, and it went down into this cast iron pan where it burst into steam. So I don't know that I would recommend doing anything that extreme, but just remember to be careful if you want to try it. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you've made a loaf that has a flowery pattern on it, so maybe you let it rise in a special basket and it has a swirly pattern, or you used a stencil. If you spritz it with water before it goes in, that flour might gunk up and not look as nice. And so this is where the bakeries have the advantage, because they just put their dough in and hit the steam button and create steam in their oven without having to spray it directly onto their dough. So in this case, spritzing your oven might be your best bet. But what I recommend is using a covered dish. And I really think this is just the best method all around, because you have your covered dish. So this could be a casserole or an old crusette or a Dutch oven of cast iron. You preheat it with the oven, and then when you put your dough in there and cover it, your dough it's totally encased by this hot surface. So that's great because it's getting great heat. But also all of the moisture from the dough gets trapped inside that container, and it just provides great steam to your dough. So one important thing is, if you do this, you have to preheat your container, but also after about 15 minutes you have to take the lid off and let the steam out. And the reason is that your dough will have trouble browning while all that steam is in there. You need to let it out so that the surface of the dough can get hotter and dry out and brown. So in the last video I talked about some options for different kinds of covered dishes you can use. A thrifty alternative would be that if you're baking on just a cookie sheet or a pizza stone, you could put some kind of oven-safe bowl upside down over your loaf, just as a temporary way to trap the steam. I will show a photo of the 2 loaves I made, and the baguette was cooked just on a cookie sheet, and then the round loaf was cooked in the orange crusette pot with the lid on. And you can see that the baguette, they both got brown, but the baguette is more dull looking, and I just think the round loaf has a nicer, shinier, nicer looking brown to it. So when you get to the oven, you have a lot of things to remember. For example, you have your dough, it's fully proofed, you score it, you open the oven door, you take your peel, you slide the dough onto the pizza stone in there, you shut the door, you turn the oven temperature down to 450, you set your timer, and then you realize you forgot to steam the dough. So I often will forget a step, so I usually make a list and then also just go over what I'm going to do in my head before I start doing it. If your dough is proofing on parchment paper, if it's on a baking sheet, that whole sheet can go into the oven. Even if you have a pizza stone in there, the baking sheet can just slide right on top of the stone. If you are on parchment but you want to go directly onto the stone, you can use a peel, and you can slide the parchment paper onto the peel and then peel the dough on the parchment onto the stone. So same thing but with no pan. If you proofed on a couche or a linen towel with cornmeal, you're going to have to transfer your loaf onto the peel or onto a cutting board and then slide it into the oven to bake on a pizza stone or some other surface. And just a note, the linen towel or the couche does not go in the oven. So just your dough and the cornmeal, not the towel. And I'm saying that because it's been done. So my plan is that my baguette and parchment is going to go on that pan, and then my round, which is rising there on parchment, is going to go into the oven, which is preheating into that old crusette pot oven. So I know it seems like I already scored them because I'm not recording these in order. Now to get everything into the oven, I'm hoping you'll be able to see most of what I'm doing, but I won't talk so that I focus and I don't mess anything up. Okay, here we go. I'm going to turn the temperature down to 450. And I'm going to set a timer for 15 minutes. Because in 15 minutes we have to take the lid off of the pot so that the steam can escape and the loaf can brown. Question is how to tell when your dough is done baking. So you can set a timer, you can monitor how brown it's getting. Some people like to take it out and thump the bottom of it and they're listening for sort of a hollow sound. But these can be a little tricky, and your dough might get really brown but it's not cooked inside. Sometimes if you haven't gotten very good steam, your dough will never get brown, so it is cooked inside but it's still pale on the outside. So I think the best way is to take the dough's temperature. And what this looks like is having a thermometer. You push it into your dough, you let the thermometer equilibrate, and then pull it out and stick it in another location and wait until it stops moving. So my magic number is 190 degrees. And the reason why is that this number is the temperature at which the starch in the dough solidifies. So theoretically, if you get to this temperature, your dough should be baked inside and not doughy. Now this number has only let me down once, and it was when I was baking with a friend at his wood-fired oven. The oven was 700 degrees. I suggested we should let it drop down to 500, but he did not want to wait. So we put the dough in, and pretty quickly it turned brown, and I pulled it out and I put a thermometer in, and it got up to 190, and I thought, well, it must be solid, but it was not. It was very doughy. So I think that what happened is the dough baking, it's a combination of that reaching that temperature, but also having the moisture in it be able to leave. And so we had cooked it so fast that the temperature got up high, but the moisture had not yet left, and so it was still doughy in the center. But as far as a home oven where you're baking at 450 or 500, 190 has never let me down. Different people have different opinions on this temperature, so you might read that 210 is the optimal final temperature, or 212 degrees Fahrenheit is the optimal temperature. I am not going to argue with that, but I just use 190 degrees Fahrenheit as the temperature at which the starch solidifies, so you know your dough will be baked inside. So there is the baguette. I think it was a little bit overproofed because I was on a video call with my family. I would have put it in the oven about 20 minutes sooner. So it did open up nicely, but I feel like it's a little flatter than it should be, and like the openings didn't, I don't know how to say it, didn't like rip as nicely, making that lip. Some people would also probably leave it in another 2 or 3 minutes to get a little bit of a darker color and an internal temperature up to, over 210. But so I'm gonna take it out now.